So yeah, Luke, I appreciate you being here. And I wanted to start by just hearing a little bit about you as an author. I think there's probably people who know that you're an author and the things that you've written, but maybe you can just share a little bit about some of the books that you've published and what kind of books you've published.
Um, sure. So I've always been a storyteller as long as I can remember. Back in grade school, my mom drove the bus, which meant I was the first one on and the last one off. And I don't know how it started because I'm fairly young at that point. But at some point, I started telling stories to the other kids on the bus, to the point that some of the kids would really scream and get angry when it was time to get off the bus because they wanted to hear the end of the story. Um, that's always just been a part of my life.
You had them eating out of the palm of your hand.
Apparently, yeah. A few years ago, my goddaughter reached confirmation age, and my goddaughter is a huge geek. She loves Harry Potter and Doctor Who and Star Wars in particular, really big into those three. And she was concerned. What was that?
Are we still allowed to say geek?
Yes.
Okay.
At least in my circles, yeah.
Or is it one of those things you're allowed to say it, I'm not? Is it one of those kind of things?
As long as you're not punching down.
Okay. Right.
But she asked me as her confirmation gift to write her some devotions or something talking about whether or not she was allowed to like these things and love Jesus. Once I'd written it, I asked her permission to share with others and sent it into a publisher, and that became Geeky and Godly, which is really a book about discernment, because it's not that Harry Potter is evil by itself or that Star Wars is evil by itself, but what do you do with it? How does it affect you? What does it lead you to think about? And so it's really about discernment using geeky things, a lot of examples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I relate that to folks that really like going to the gym. It's probably a great thing unless it's your ultimate thing.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So yeah, lots of what I did in there is I focused on what I call tropes. It's a fairly common word. You can look up tvtropes.com. It's a great site that'll suck you in. And so I picked up some very common science fiction or fantasy tropes like the quest, or exploration in outer space, or alternate universes. And if you really like those things, what are some things to watch out for? What are some things that you can say, hey, you can see shadows of Christ here? And the publisher has picked up book 2, although I don't know what's happening with that because the publisher has gone a little quiet in the last couple of years. So I don't know exactly what's going on there.
So it's a book 2 of that same exploration?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. This one was science fiction and fantasy. The next one is magic and, it's been too long since I've written, I don't remember. It focuses on some other aspects. Magic and superheroes, that's what it is.
Okay. Can you elaborate a little bit about Shadows of Christ? What do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. So one of my very favorite tropes is alternate universes. In Star Trek, Spock has a goatee and he's evil in another universe. More recently, there is Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness and Spider-Man No Way Home, which really dealt with this idea of there are other universes where things went differently and what would happen if something happened differently. And one of the things that's always a theme, or very often a theme in those stories, is there's a way things are supposed to be. Spock is supposed to be a good guy. Spider-Man is supposed to help the bad guys. There's a supposed to be. Well, if there's a supposed to be, that kind of gives the idea that someone has a plan, that there is a right way things are supposed to be. And you see that little shadow of, no, there's a little shadow here, some natural knowledge of God peeking out saying, hey, look, there's something there. You can talk about that, use that as a thread to pull on. Well, what do you mean supposed to be? What is this world supposed to be?
Yeah, so even the non-Christian, even somebody who's maybe oppositional to the Christian worldview, because of the natural knowledge of God, some of the things that are in this universe leak through into their writings, and so we might see shadows of a sacrificial person, of a person who's sacrificial, or we might see, is that sort of the
Well,
okay.
years ago, I did a teen Bible study on The Dark Knight. And so that movie's a little older at this point, but I think it's considered a classic now. Spoilers. At the end of the movie, one of the good guys becomes evil. Harvey Dent becomes Two-Face. And at the end of the movie, Batman says, no one has to know what he's did. Pin the crimes on me, so that he can go he can go free. And I use that as hey, that's Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
He said, let me be guilty. Go ahead, accuse me of everything that person's done wrong. Let them be declared innocent.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I know, no one in that movie was Christian, or at least I don't know of them if they are.
Yeah, so this idea of someone as a substitute for someone else, and an innocent person accepting the blame on someone else's behalf. They may or may not have a Christian background, but you see shadows of these things kind of percolating through the stories, perhaps just because the universe we live, God made the universe we live in, and it leaks through.
Exactly. I've got two other books that are totally different. So I wrote for a while for a website called Bread for Beggars. The website
great website, by the way. Check it out. Read all your stuff on depression there. It's a great blog on there, and introduced me to a lot of great music from that website as well.
Yes. So I took a lot of the things I've written there and turned them into a book called Hollow Heart, which is about what God says about depression, and it's about my own journey with depression. And then some people learn much more by story. I'm actually one of those people. If I have a choice between a novel and nonfiction, I will almost always pick the novel. That's just how I'm wired. And so I took the story of Elijah from 1st and 2nd Kings, and I see him having depression. Now, obviously, he was never diagnosed using modern methods. No one did an interview with him, so I can't say that for sure. But I wrote his story through that lens of saying, well, if he had depression, this is what his story would have looked like. And these last two, we self-published, my wife and I.
Okay.
So I've worked with publishers before, and I've worked with self-publishing.
Okay. So those two, the first one is sort of some theological background and part memoir, maybe?
This one?
Right.
Hollow Heart, yes.
And then the other one is digging deep into the prophet Elijah, and looking at him with the idea, is it possible he had depression, and what are some of the thinkings and maybe some helpful thoughts around that?
Yep.
Okay. So the first book that you published, that was through a publisher. Those two were self-published, but I understand that you're also just very prolific, perhaps under is it nom de plume, I think is the French
I
for
use
that?
a pen name as well. For the last year and a half, I've written a book a month. And also not just rough draft, but then revise, get it edited. Anything I publish goes through at least 4 revisions, so 5 drafts by the time other people see it. Don't send out rough drafts. That's never a good idea. And yes, I've had 2 novels published under that pen name from another publisher. I've had numerous dozens of short stories published all over the place. And I now have 4 self-published novels, 2 more for sure coming out. And then my wife/editor just started editing the next 6-book series. So yes, all sorts of stuff.
I think that qualifies as prolific. I'm not sure what the cutoff is, but that might be prolific author.
I think so. It helps that most books are relatively short. My fiction books average about 250 pages, which is not that long, really.
It's not exactly a novella either. That's a novel. Yeah.
But if you when I'm going, I write about 2,000 words an hour, which is a lot. But it means that you can write one of those in 3 weeks. pretty
Mhm.
easy.
Wow. Okay, so those are some of the things that you've published. My
Yes.
next set of questions is just maybe about the act of writing itself. Do you have habits or suggestions, or stay away from this kind of advice for anyone who's interested in being an author?
Um, First off, everyone does this very differently. If anyone ever says you have to write in a certain way, ignore them. Maybe try it out, see if it works for you. But there's so many different paths and ways of writing. All I can say is what works for me, um, while understanding that there are so many ways to do it. Um, when it comes to actually sitting down and getting writing done, I have found for me having a, call it a ritual, call it a habit or a tradition of how to get started, helps my brain click into gear to say, oh, this is what we're doing now. Um, we all have certain things that work that way. Many church services have a certain pattern that helps your mind say, this is what we're doing now.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I keep track of when and how much I write. I use a spreadsheet. So I will open up the spreadsheet and just put in date, time, and whatever the current work in progress is. And then I've got a notation for what draft I happen to be on. If it's a rough draft, if it's draft 4, whatever. And then I will turn on music. And I've got certain musics that I listen to. It has to be something that I can ignore.
Mm-hmm.
Which means for me, it has to be something relatively familiar or something that's in a very familiar style. Soundtracks and certain bands work for me personally. Then I play one game of something relatively mindless. It might be Spider Solitaire, it might be whatever the game du jour is on my phone, but something that I can sink into that is brainless so I can start going, okay, this is where I left off. And then I sit down and I start typing. Pre-work, I have found that I also write much faster if I outline ahead. So I can look at my outline, I can say, this chapter, this character has to do this thing, has to discover this matter. Go. And that just helps. I don't have to think about what I'm doing. It's just spitting the words out. Whereas if I don't have that outline, I have to figure out where I'm going. Who is this character? And then I'm much slower.
Yeah, that's where I'm picturing the balled up paper that just, you just keep up balling. I start going down this path. That's not the right way. I start going down the path. And so you've got a clear idea of where you're going, and you're mostly focusing on how to phrase it and maybe the pacing of it.
Yep. Yeah, my first novel took a decade to write. Now I'm writing one a month.
So there's a bit of a learning curve as well, apparently, that writing one gives you some skills that translate to the next novel as well.
And I would also highly encourage the first time you sit down and write, it's going to be painful, not just for the quality, but for how long it takes you to do anything. Writing is a muscle. Using your imagination or doing research and writing nonfiction, it's a muscle. The more you use it, not only the better will you'll get, but the faster you'll get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's encouraging advice rather than the it's inspiration from the sky and you either got it or you don't. It sounds like
it's not. I will say, every once in a while, someone will send me an idea and say, yeah, I'm not a writer, but here's a story idea you can take. And I don't take those. I don't need to. I've used the imagination enough that no, I actually have. I told you I'm writing a book a month. I'm plotted out what books I'm writing for the next 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I have that many novel ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I've already, okay, here's a 6-book series, here's a 6-book series, here's a trilogy. I don't need to ask other people for ideas.
Right. I had a high school teacher that was quite a composer, and somebody came up to him and is like, I got this melody, and he knew nothing about music and hummed it to him. And he's like, yeah, I wrote down the melody for him. I didn't come up with a whole orchestration behind it or anything. But yeah, I think sometimes people, they have an idea, they don't have any of the scaffolding and the skills that you would need to bring it to fruition, and they just want to share it with someone.
Yep. And I am honored that someone would do that for me, but I don't need it. I would rather
Right.
they take and use that story for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So that's a little bit about the process of writing. I did have a question. You talked about your spreadsheet. Does it also include the amount? Is there like a numerical, how many words you've written that day, or it just tracks
Yes. So
progress? Okay.
I track date, time, and then I keep a running total of how long I've worked on this particular project.
Mm,
And that way I can compare totals for, okay, that novel took me 1,600 minutes to write. This one only took me 800. What was different?
okay.
How can I learn from that? Am I strengthening those muscles, or is that particular book just easier to write, or is that particular book crappier because I spent less time on it?
Uh-huh.
I also keep a running track of words.
Mm-hmm.
So if I wrote yesterday, I only wrote 750 words in an hour, feeling out a new book. And the beginning of each book is usually slower as I'm feeling it out. By the time I get to the end, it's way faster. The last book I finished, I was writing close to 3,500 words an hour, which is insane. So I'll record how much I wrote in that hour, and then I will also keep a running tally of how long that particular work in progress is.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of everything I write, every major project, I will then calculate how many words per minute on average, so that I can see how I'm doing.
Okay. Sounds like you've already seen that as you get into a project, you speed up a bit. That the beginning, there's a bit more kind of feeling yourself out. Maybe you're a bit more tenuous in your writing. Anything else that you've observed? That's interesting. I don't know too many people who are both creative and can do the creative part and are a little bit geeky on the quantitative side of things and are studying what have you, are there any interesting insights from just the numerical side of things that tell you about good writing practices or how you work? Or
there's a couple of duh things which really are duh but need to be shared. Turn off the social media, which is duh. But if I'm in the middle of a conversation with someone, because I will often use Messenger and I'll have conversations, and I don't want to cut that off in the middle. Mm-hmm. That seems really weird to me. Oh yeah, I'm going to go, right, goodbye. Have fun with whatever problem you're having. So I'll often try to double up, and that's not a good idea. Because then you're not paying attention to the conversation or the writing. Neither of them turns out that good.
Right.
Usually
you don't want to mix those two either, right? Where also you're like starting to type also to them true. About I don't know, Zebulon B and the whatever science fiction creature you're talking about, and they're talking to you about some theological issue. Yeah.
So yeah, cut out the distractions. I've been trying to learn how to write with my 4-year-old around, because she's just always around. Mm-hmm. And if I could write with her in the room, I would have significantly more writing time. I have not learned how to do that yet. Still working on that. I have found too that sorry, went out of the head. No, I don't know.
Okay, so no social media. That seems to bring production down, and having a 4-year-old in the room, probably incompatible. So no, not having your mind split in any way. Anything else that you've seen?
I have found for me, and I know some other writers do this as well, that if you give yourself a cutoff time, you end up writing more in that hour. I don't know if you know the adage, work expands to fill up the space you give it. Mm-hmm. That is true in my life, at least. My son is really involved with the library. He's involved with a lot of the teen activities at the library. So I will often go with him. I'll bring my laptop, I'll sit down, and I will have that hour to work. Mm-hmm. And when I have that 1 hour, I knock out a lot of work. Whereas if I have a whole afternoon, which doesn't often happen, but if I happen to have a whole afternoon, I won't get as much work done in that afternoon as that 1 hour that I know I've got at the library. So setting limits, and for me, if they're externally set, like I have that 1 hour. When my son is done with that activity, he's showing up and we're going to leave. Mm-hmm. If I tell him, give me 5 more minutes, he's going to loom on the other side of my laptop watching me.
Are you done yet? Are you done yet? Are you done yet?
Knowing that I get more work done. For me,
Mhm.
the self-imposed is harder to pay attention
Mhm.
to, because I know the idiot who set that goal. I can ignore him.
Right. Who's that guy? Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. I remember as a therapist, I would sometimes write my notes at home, and when the laptop went up, it was like a siren call for my children. And all of a sudden, like they wanted me to watch everything, whether it was something very mundane that they were doing, they just wanted daddy to look at it.
Yep.
Yeah. But I also really like that idea too of giving yourself, well, it's not even giving yourself a time limit. You're giving yourself a goal to reach with some externally set time constraints.
Yep.
And that helps. During this time, I'm going to try and get this done. And there's a hard stop at the end of that. Yeah. Yeah, that makes total sense. Well, based on what you've done, this is where I'm going to just kind of transfer into shamelessly asking you for to be my consultant. All right. So I've written a book, which you've seen, which has some stuff at the beginning of it about addiction and the process of confession and absolution. And then it has some lessons. So I've been taking that book, and I go to like 4 or 5 rehabs a week. I'm workshopping those lessons. So those are updated, different questions. And then I have an additional, I think there's 18 lessons in the current one. I've probably got an additional 24 or so, right?
Good.
So I would like to do another edition of that. And in the past, I used KDP to self-publish that on Amazon. And I used Fiverr to get somebody to edit it. I also shopped it out to other people to edit it, 2 different people. So it was edited by somebody from Fiverr. It was edited by 2 different people, and there's still typos in it. I set it myself. I did the typesetting myself, and I'm not super happy with it. And the
What
cover
program did you use for that?
I downloaded a template from KDP for the size book that it was, and then did it in Word, and then made it a PDF so I could upload it.
Okay.
And then KDP has a software that allows you to see a mock-up of it, so you can make sure the pages, which was important for my book, and then I get a copy, a test copy, a single test copy, and then I'll go ahead and make it live.
Yep.
So, and it was all self-funded. I don't think I had any grant money or anything to do it. So if we just go, okay, I have, at this point, I've got an introduction. I'm going to kind of do things differently in terms of things that people use in the meeting, so that the guidelines and the acronym and things that we might read are all going to be closer together because they're all over the book. So I'll change the order of the things, and I'm adding new lessons in, and I'm updating it. Yeah, what is your advice to me in terms of how to go about publishing it, how to maximize, so some practical tips about publishing it, any practical tips about finding funding for it, any practical tips about advertising it? So,
all right. So really broad.
Tell me what to do.
So the first thing you want to do is make sure you know what your goal is.
Mm-hmm.
If your goal is just to use it for resilient recovery, what you're doing is perfect. You've already achieved your goal. If you're looking to make it to the New York Times bestseller list, if you're looking to really get bigger, that's a different goal.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need to have that goal set ahead of time. That's something that my wife and I, as we're self-publishing a bunch of these books, really need to look at. And we've set goals for each year. By this year, we're going to be selling this many books. By this year, we're going to be selling this many more books. We're going to conventions and selling books there. How many cons are we going to? And depending on what your goal is, you're going to change what you're doing.
Mhm.
Now, using KDP, that is Amazon's self-publishing platform, and that has both benefits and drawbacks. One of the drawbacks is you are married to Amazon right now. They own the ISBN, which is the number that identifies your book to the Library of Congress and to anyone else who wants to order it. If someone wants to go to Barnes & Noble, they can't get your book. Amazon is international, but internationally there are other booksellers that are better set up. Kobo, for instance, is much better set up if you want to sell to Canada. And that's one of the things. There's basically two big philosophies when it comes to self-publishing. You can go through Amazon or you can go wide. And both have benefits and both have drawbacks.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to figure out what your goal is. Who are you trying to reach? Our self-publishing fiction is middle grade. Middle grade readers typically don't read digital books. Amazon is ideally set up for digital books. You can definitely buy physical copies there. But if you're not buying digital, people go a lot wider than that. And so we went wide. We are not Amazon only. Positive, you get your stuff in so many more stores. You can go to walmart.com and buy my stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Ta-da! Downside is Amazon pushes the books that go through KDP much more. So you're going to be seeing less Amazon traffic. So knowing where your audience is may change what you're trying to do. Oddly enough, we've been selling a lot of books in the UK, Germany, Poland, France, and Czechoslovakia. I don't know why. I have no idea how that happened, but I know it's not through Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to stay wide, because if I can keep my European readers happy, I don't know where they came from. Cool. We're going to keep on doing that.
Interesting. Yeah, and you'd have no idea. That wasn't something you planned. That was a market that found you.
Yep, exactly. I would recommend, it sounds like KDP has been fairly good to you for your current goals.
Mm-hmm.
If it's working for you, keep on going with it. As I said, the only drawback is Amazon owns you. If Amazon decides for whatever reason to say, we don't like your book, you're screwed.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing you can do. The Amazon appeal process is more difficult than appealing disability. It really is. It's a pain. And 99 times out of 100, Amazon does not change its mind.
Uh-huh.
And unfortunately, Amazon's rules sometimes are really weird. Mm-hmm. Speaking on the fiction side, I know authors that have written about the Revolutionary War. And so on their cover, they will have a Revolutionary War soldier holding a gun, holding a musket or whatever. And Amazon will say, no, you're not allowed to have weapons on your cover. And they will simply not sell that book. Period. And that person, if they were going just through Amazon, that's it. They're done. Given the content. Go ahead. Yeah.
A friend of mine published a review of a book on anxiety and faith. I believe it was a review, and it was taken down from whatever the format was, whatever the platform was. I'm sorry, because they felt that you were not allowed to talk about a psychiatric issue from a Christian point of view. That it was a psychiatric issue, and you would, I assume they were saying that you would be heaping guilt and shame on somebody who had a disease which could only be solved through medication, and that there's no spiritual aspect to it. So that would be another example of something where a platform might decide you are misinformation, and we're taking you down.
And that is a benefit of going wide, is that if you lose one platform, you've lost one platform. That's not good, but you're on 20 others.
So let's say, somebody with, well, let's not characterize this person. Let's just say a very well-meaning person with a very modern post-Enlightenment view of the world saw my book and decided that I was heaping shame upon people who need to be treated with medicine instead, and they shut down my book, could I republish the same book somewhere else, or are they also saying we're treating this as our material and you can't shop it around elsewhere?
So what catches you there is that Amazon owns your ISBN.
Uh-huh.
You would need to, at the very least, purchase a new ISBN, and different platforms will have different rules on whether or not they will allow the same book with a different ISBN. Because the book and the ISBN are married.
Okay.
Now, with you doing a new edition, you will need a new ISBN no matter what. And this is where nearly every major platform allows you to use their ISBN. They're very gracious, but then again, you're married to their platform. ISBNs can be really pricey unless you purchase them in bulk. There is only one place in the US to buy ISBNs. It's Bowker.com, BOWKER.com. If you buy one, if I remember right, it's something like $200. And if you're doing an ebook and a physical copy, you need 2 ISBNs.
Yeah.
If you ever do a large print, you need a 3rd ISBN. If you do a hardcover, that's a 4th ISBN.
Yeah, we're up around $1,000 there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, what we did is we purchased 100, and purchasing 100 at the time we purchased was $550.
Wow. There's definitely a markdown when you were buying in bulk.
Yes, and don't quote me on those numbers because that's not exact, but it is significantly cheaper per. And if you buy 1,000, if I remember right, it's something like $2,000 to get 1,000. Again, significantly cheaper. But
and then you later marry that to the title of the book because you own the. Yeah, there's nothing about the number itself that includes the title or anything like that. They're just sort of random numbers. Okay.
Yep. So yeah, that the ISBNs for us, the major costs were ISBNs and the covers, because my wife is a professional editor, and then we have friends beta reading that we trust to be able to tell us if it's crap. They'll tell us it's crap. Editing is the other major cost. We got to skip that. Covers can cost a lot of money. Our cover for Hollow Heart, we actually commissioned an artist to do this. Was it Maida Jasperson? Maida Jasperson made this for us. And she did a great job showing someone who's desperate and praying. This cost us about $250. Now we have the rights to this. We can do whatever we want with the art, but that's still $250. You can go with a photograph. This was free. Our publisher took this photograph. However, that's my goddaughter and that's my son, so we got free models.
But they were very temperamental and demanding about how things function on the set.
My son was, but he was a little grumpy that day. But frankly, photographs don't often work as covers in the modern market. It really stinks. They say you shouldn't judge a book by your cover, but the cover is what makes people pick up the book to look at the back of it or to decide whether or not to pick it up. This cover, I love this cover. I think it is very evocative. And Elijah's story starts with ravens. It starts with ravens feeding him. I would recommend, depending on what kind of cover you're looking for, getcovers.com, all one word, getcovers.com made this. We paid $35 for this cover. That is significantly cheaper than just about anywhere else.
Wow.
They're very good at what they're very good at, and they are not good at anything else.
Okay. What are they very good at?
They specialize in romance and young adult. They are branching out and they are doing nonfiction as well. So they're starting that process. This one, they took some of their templates for young adult, for YA novels, and used it. You might be able to see that there. We tried using them for our middle grade books. Middle grade and young adult have a very different look to them. they did not do good. We ended up going with a different we ended up going with a different company for our middle grade books then after that. So yeah, getcovers.com. I would suggest checking them out and just seeing if there's something there, because they're so cheap. What we've ended up doing is we have banked our credit with them, because we purchased a 6-book series and then said, after the first 2 books, said, this is not working out. We're going to do a different thing. We're going to take our 4 credits and we're going to be using them for further nonfiction books that I have coming out in the next few years.
Okay. Good to know.
They're very easy to work with too.
Okay. So it sounds like take a look at what they're doing with nonfiction, and if it seems like it might work, that's not a huge sunk cost. If if I end up not liking it, it's negligible.
I will say, I think they've got a limit. You can only sell 250,000 copies of the book with that art. For most of us, that will be fine.
Right. Yeah. Have you heard about the Pareto distribution with book publishing?
No.
It's like they call it the 80-20 rule, where 20% of people in a workplace are doing 80% of the work. Income a lot of time is distributed this way. And a lot of creative fields are the same way. So there's 20% of artists are selling 80% of say rock musicians, right? But of that 20%, if you take the top 20% of that 20%, they're selling more than, and it just keeps going like that. So very few people are going to sell 1 million copies. That's a tiny sliver of all of the people that are out there. Even if you're
not everyone can be Stephen King or James Patterson.
Like only they can be, pretty much.
Yeah.
Interesting. How about typesetting?
So there you'd have to talk to my wife. So the way we split it is I do a lot of the creative stuff. It's hilarious because I will sit down and I'll knock out a book a month, and she gets really angry with me because it takes her longer to edit. And I will do several revisions before I give it to her. I don't give her a rough copy. I'm not going to do that to her. But she does a lot of the invisible stuff. She will point out in the editing, for instance, the book she's editing right now. Do you realize that the main character doesn't have a story arc? There's a lot of plot, but he doesn't change. Oh, okay, well that's an issue. This particular book series is much more plot heavy. It's aimed at 12-year-old boys. It's much more about plot than personality necessarily. But she's right. That's something that needs to be fixed. And having that eye in there is so important. She's also the one that formats the books. And we use a formatter called Atticus. Atticus. We actually bought it in beta. And because of that, we got it way cheaper. It's no longer in beta. But they've got it is a formatter, it is an editor, it lets you do a lot of stuff that is just very helpful. They started in fiction, they're now in nonfiction. My wife was swearing because there was no way to do footnotes originally, and now there is. So that is very helpful for us. But that comes with a choice of typesetting, that comes with, they call them themes. So you can choose, for instance, you'll have your chapter title, whatever it is, and then do you want an indent, or do you want spaces between the paragraphs? How do you want it to look? It also lets you put in custom scene breaks. So we've got feathers as the scene break there. Whereas in Hollow Heart, we've got section headings, and then our chapters look pretty different compared to the fiction. We've got footnotes, we've got pull quotes on the side. So it looks much more like nonfiction. If you want to know, go ahead.
I was just going to say, she's wearing a lot of hats. Because they're sort of, I don't know what the title would be, but there's the person who's just looking for the typos and the grammatical, so on. She's also looking at it thematically. and able to
Yep.
give you some feedback that I would expect like an editor at a book publisher to be able to know typical things that need to be in books, and where there's weakness, that editor can help with that.
Yep.
Also doing typesetting. Yeah, so she's
Yep.
wearing a number of different hats.
She is, and she's doing a phenomenal job with it.
I hope you're paying her well.
She likes getting paid in chocolate chip cookies.
All right, good deal.
The goal here is, we are working together. The goal is, because of my depression and because the depression has been getting worse, that's relatively normal as the body ages. What used to work doesn't. You need to find different things. I currently serve as a pastor. I'm expecting that at some point I'm not going to be able to do that. Last week, I wasn't able to see any of my members. This week, I had several members come up to me on Sunday and say, "Hey, can we get together?" And I had to tell them, "Let me wait and see how I'm doing tomorrow, and then I'll give you a call." Now, in a short-term situation, that's fine. Every pastor, I think, has to do stuff like that to a certain extent. Not this week, next week. But when and if that becomes regular, I can't faithfully serve as a pastor if I can't be with my people. And so we're aiming at this to become the way to support the family. So this is a long range project. We are not breaking even yet.
Right.
We're getting close, but
it almost sounds like homesteaders. You guys are working together as husband and wife to make this little homestead function, and it takes two, but it's a group, it's a mutual project, right?
Yeah. Yes. And it's something, honestly, my wife enjoys. Usually, every once in a while she'll say things at me that are not too nice, but generally she enjoys it too.
Yeah, that's good, right? If they're complementary skills and you enjoy exercising them. I think that's
a couple of resources too.
Yeah.
I would highly recommend anyone who's doing writing and looking to make some sort of money from it, whether it's career or supplemental income. There is a great Facebook group called 20 Books to 50K. It is a group focused on the business of writing. You'd mentioned earlier about tracking things and how that's very analytical. I got that from 20 Books. It's not about growing your skill. They say, we're going to assume that you know how to write. If you don't know how to write, go to these other places. We're not the place for that. But it will give advice. Authors will pop in and say, okay, I've made my first 4-figure month. This is what I did. I made my first 10-figure month. This is what I did. I sold at a live event, and these things happened, and this was the result. I learned a lot from that site when it comes to the business, and that includes things like typesetting. That includes things like how do I make it look right. Really, really highly recommend that site. Just fantastic. Also, when it comes to covers and typesetting, take a look at the other stuff that's in these same. They're called also bots. If you go on Amazon and 50 people buy your book, you'll see a little thing. These people also bought this item.
Okay.
You want your book to look like theirs. Because if it doesn't, people will notice. And oddly enough, that's usually not a good thing. You want it to look professional, and professional for whatever that genre, that subset of writing is.
Well, professional for sure, right? There's something about expertness. I see a diploma behind you on the wall. I've got one as well. There's something about expertness. There's also something about, if I don't have to expend cognitive calories to figure out your format, I can spend it consuming your content. And so it's a kindness to the reader to be super clear.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
use the conventions that they're familiar with, so they don't have to relearn a new set of markers and identifiers and groupers and so on.
And at least in theory, the writer should be reading within the genre that they're writing for.
Mm-hmm.
I read plenty of biblical fiction, so I knew what it looked like.
Mm-hmm.
I read plenty of fiction in general, especially science fiction and fantasy. That's just my thing. Mm-hmm. So I know what it's supposed to look like. If you pick up a science fiction book, but the inside is all fantasy, but the outside shows a spaceship, something happened there, and you're going to be confused.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't want to confuse our readers. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember a number of years ago, my wife and I wanted to see a certain movie that was advertised as a romantic comedy, as a rom-com. And we went in, and it was not a romantic comedy. It was just a romance. And we walked out really disappointed and not interested in ever seeing that movie again. Not because it was a bad movie.
Your expectations were other.
Exactly. And so your formatting, your cover, all of that speaks toward what should I expect when I pick up this book.
Very good advice. Yeah. You and I have talked a bit about this when you were out here in Phoenix, but I'm interested in some of the sort of group funding or crowdfunding that you had used for some books. What could you tell people about that?
So Kickstarter is a fantastic site for publishing. I recommend it if you are already part of the ecology, is what it's called. If you have never backed something on Kickstarter, do not try to fund something on Kickstarter. Because you're not going to know what people who are funding there expect. And just like the covers, if you don't go with what they expect, you're not going to get your funding. You're not going to get the people looking at it. At this point, I have backed something like 50 projects. I really enjoy helping authors and game makers in that setting. That's just something I enjoy. So the way Kickstarter works is that people will present a project. I need funding for this. And Kickstarter provides a platform for a bunch of people to come together and say, here are these projects. And you have a deadline. I need to be funded by this point in time. I believe you can put up to 3 months. The standard for publishing is 1 month. If you go more than 1 month, I very rarely see those who go that far out actually succeed. 1 month is a good amount. Excuse me. And you put together a campaign. And what I have seen work in publishing is you don't say, hey, I need money for a cover. Very few people are excited about funding a cover. But you present, this is a book that does this thing. For us, what we did is we sold it as a subscription. We have 6 books. They are all written. They are done. We would like to be funded so that we can sell it as a subscription. If you fund us, you get 6 books over the course of a school year for your middle grade student. The entire series in 1 school year. Go. So it's kind of a gimmick. But that's what we did. And then we made a full quarter of the first book available for free. You want to test it out? Go. We had the covers plastered all over. Lots of images. Images are really important. This is what the book looks like. Here's some images from the inside. Here's a picture of the author. Don't look at that. And just telling the story of the book. Imagine it as the campaign is the back of your book, bigger. You want to be attractive to the eye. You want to be attractive to the mind. And what'll happen, and I do this. I know a number of people who do this. I go to Kickstarter a couple times a week, and I will just scroll through the new projects in publishing. I will look at gaming sometimes as well. I don't usually look at the other areas. There's lots of different areas to go to. And I'll look at those and I'll say, oh, this one looks interesting. And I'll click on it and I'll see, oh yeah, that's something I want to back. I'm currently reading an urban fantasy fiction that I backed. I got the first 4 novels for $15 digitally. Kickstarter is typically either cheaper than buying it in a bookstore, or it will come with perks. I backed a science fiction trilogy a few years ago, and the author sent hand-drawn sketches of some of the characters because the author was also an artist. That was one of the perks. So you'll often have some sort of perk for backing on Kickstarter beyond just getting the product.
Mm-hmm.
It might be an exclusive chapter. You get 30 extra pages. It is very common if someone writes a romance, for instance, for Kickstarter, that only Kickstarters get the 5 years later epilogue where you get to see where everyone ended up. Something like that probably won't work for your book.
Right. Well, I'm also just as you're saying that, I'm thinking I need to really be clear about the goal still. I mean, one of the first things that we talked about is, for the most part, I hand these out at rehabs and people purchase them to run a resilient group. So it's like, but it does different things. It gives a little smattering of advice about how to run the group. It has the lessons themselves. It has a bit of an introduction. And I wonder if I need to get more clear about what the goal is, not just in terms of what I want to sell, but what I want people to do with the book.
Taking the book as it currently stands, one of the ways that you could pitch it on Kickstarter or in other ways is, do you as a church want to support recovery? This book is your guide on how to do that. It includes sample devotions. It includes guidelines for the facilitator. And you can do it that way. I actually recently backed 2 projects on Kickstarter that did that for teaching storytelling in classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to teach your 5th grade classroom how to tell stories? Here's a book, and it includes, like, 3/4 of the book is, here's an example of how you can do that, not just how to make it on your own, but, okay, you're a character, you have a character, you come to a bridge, the bridge is out. Here's some options. What does your class want to do? And it's actually a fantastic product. I've really enjoyed reading through it. That may be a way to pitch it, to say, hey, this is what it is. I will warn you that Kickstarter it does not have animosity toward Christians, but there isn't as much of an audience there if you lead with that. The publisher actually did Geeky and Godly through Kickstarter. Now I was involved with that because as the author, I was involved, but I was not the one running it. But I can tell you that many of our backers for Geeky and Godly were people that already knew us. We did not get many new people. So if we had just gone to our friends and said, hey, will you buy this? We would have made as much money. We would have gotten as much funding. On the other hand, our 6-book series, about half the people that backed are people that I have no clue who they are. Never met them. Maybe I will someday, but they were not backing because they knew me. They read the project and said, this looks like something I want to back.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I'm thinking that so one goal would be to educate a church about, if you're interested in this ministry. I'm also thinking about guys in rehab that have a lot of time on their hands and are thinking, our church body has this pamphlet that they hand out, but they send to people who are in prison, and it's Jesus is Lord, not addiction, or something along those lines. And it's specifically targeted to individuals who are incarcerated. And I think that there's maybe the version of the book that I have or something like it that is targeted, hi, you're in rehab, and like kind of walks through and maybe has some of that format that they can learn a little bit about addiction and the Bible, and then also has some devotions that they can go through. I think
there's a lot of overlap in your book, but as it is, you're selling the same thing to 2 different audiences, and it would be hard to manage both at the same time.
Yeah, that's almost 2 different books, right? Yeah.
Again, a lot of overlap, but it's different audience.
Well, and it gets into that question again of what are people expecting and how do you make that clear? And if you've got something that lives in this nebulous space, border region between 2 countries, that's probably more confusing than it is helpful. So I think that's something that I need to do before I get too much further into things, is really clarify who is the reader and what's the goal for that reader. And then some of these other things will fall into place. Like it really comes, it's really kind of top down, right? It comes from the vision, and all of those other things naturally lead up to it, or they don't, and they confuse people, and they make it less functional or desirable or useful or whatever. Okay.
And when you do that, it also helps you figure out who your audience isn't.
Yeah, that's huge. That is huge. That is such a, especially, when you're like me, started out doing a ministry, and it was kind of a catch-all, right? The more I've gotten clear about what I don't do, the better off I am. But there's a certain, for a person like me who's very open to experience and creative and lives in the borderlands, it's difficult to narrow it down and go, I'm going to be cutting people out if I do this. And yet that's probably exactly what I need to do, is to narrow it down and cut out. No, it's not for these people. It's not for this situation. Because I would love to just, yes, it's for you and for you and for you. And it's going to, that's the, thanks for the therapy session.
AA is not a Star Trek convention.
Yeah.
Let the Star Trek convention be the Star Trek convention. Let AA be AA.
Yeah.
Same thing with books. Let that book be what it is. And it's not what it's not.
Yeah. And if I need to do two different books, then I need to do two different books. If there's enough need for both of those things. But it's probably not a good idea to do a mashup.
It would be difficult unless you sold it as like an omnibus or something like that. But that's
then you'd also have to have, like, you could do it then. It's the encyclopedia of whatever, right?
There you go.
But that again is a huge task. And there's certain people who aren't going to pick up the encyclopedia. They want the
Mason's Germain Jottings, volume 17.
Yes. Well, when you say it that way, you can hear the arrogance and the narcissism and keeping it nebulous. Well, these things are all interesting to me, so other people must be fascinated as well by the things I jot down and think. Yes, they must be on the edge of their seats waiting to hear the next fascinating little tidbit that falls off the end of my fingers and into my computer.
If you're looking to investigate Kickstarter more, first off, just make sure you're familiar with the site. Another Facebook group, Kickstarter for Authors. I'm very active on that site. Really helpful in figuring out what works and what doesn't. Relatively recently, Brandon Sanderson ran the most successful Kickstarter ever. There were $17 million in pledges for 5 of his books. Brandon Sanderson is also a best-selling fantasy author. He wrote the last 3 books of The Wheel of Time, which is an Amazon Prime series, TV series now. He's a big name. And so there was a flood of authors after that getting onto Kickstarter and trying to make their millions. And that is not the way it is. $300 to $500 is what you look for usually for a book and Kickstarter. Having said that, we got $3,500 for that 6-book series. So it can vary pretty widely, but you're not going to make your millions off Kickstarter. That gets you started. That gives you an initial audience.
Right. Yeah. So it's not even necessary. Well, not necessarily, but it's not exclusively about the income that you make. It's also about publicizing it and developing an audience. And again, that's that Pareto distribution where one person is going to make lots and lots of money. Most people are going to make much, much less.
Yep.
And that's just kind of the way it is.
And Kickstarter was free marketing for us. That's how we looked at it. Said, we think we can back at this level. We think we'll get this much. But it doubled our audience simply because enough people saw it, enough people backed it. And we're still, book 5 and 6 will be shipped out in the next few months.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. very, very knowledgeable, very interesting, gives me a lot to think about. Any of those topics that we've talked about that you think there's something we missed?
Just use those resources that are online. There is Book Talk. If you happen to be on TikTok, look up Book Talk. You can get a lot of author advice on there. TikTok is also free marketing if you use it well. Free for money, not free for time. It can take
Do I
up
have
a
to
lot.
dance?
I have not yet.
Okay. Because I'm Dutch and we break. When we try and dance, things snap and they don't go back into place.
I'm very German. I understand.
Yeah.
But use some of those resources, the 20 books to 50K, the Kickstarter for authors on both those groups on Facebook. Their philosophies are a rising tide. A tide raises all ships. That's what it is. So the idea is that as authors, we're going to help each other out. What worked for you? I want to learn from that. What worked for me? Here, I'm going to give it out for free. And that philosophy has been just so nice. The idea that no author competes with another, because most readers read more than any author can write. So if they're buying your stuff and my stuff is like it, let's support each other. Maybe my readers will read your stuff and your readers will read my stuff. And because of that philosophy, there's just so much good out there that's shared that can help people figure out what's going to work for me.
It reminds me too that the Pareto distribution works for alcohol drinkers, and it probably also works for readers. That there's certain readers who read 50 books a year, whereas most people read none, and some people read one or two. A few people read a book a month, but there's this subset of people that is reading all the books all the time, and there's enough need for content there that you guys can support each other and share that group of people, right?
There's a group that runs a summer reading challenge that I also, as an author, I try to be in as many different groups as possible just to see what's going on. I can't be active in them all, but I can see what's going on. And they run a summer reading challenge, and there are readers that read 50 novels over the summer. Like, how?
Yeah.
How do you do that? I can't do that.
Yep. But they exist, right? And those and that's probably your key market. People who are selling alcohol are making 90% of their money off this really small group of people that's just down in alcohol.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, cool. I really appreciate all of this advice and ideas and things to look at. For me, it's a little bit sobering to know I got to go back and I got to really make sure I know what this book is about. And then there's lots of good tips in here that we talked about. Once I know that, then I can start to look at the cover and the typesetting and where it's published and how it's published, and all those things that we talked about are going to flow from that. But as is typical with me, I'm always a little wider than I should be, and I've got to narrow down that what is that goal and that focus, and then make my decisions from there.
It may be helpful too to think, you've got more than one book in you from what you're saying. Your goal does not have to be decided this year. You can have multiple goals and have as self-publishers, we've got a 5-year plan. We know we're going to be we know we're aiming to be in 5 years. You can do that with your books too. I've got volume 2, or the second edition ready in the next couple of months. We're going to whittle it down. We're going to do a little bit more editing. We're pretty close to done. But then I've got the next one. You've got some time in you yet. You don't have to have this decided tomorrow.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's encouraging. Have you ever thought of working with people in some way, sort of in a shepherding kind of capacity, where you encourage them? And is that?
Yes and no. It's kind of funny because I've had these kind of conversations a few times. My goddaughter is currently a senior in high school, and she ran a Bible study on this for other people that wanted to be writers. And then I was visiting her this past fall, and she said, "Can you come speak to my group about all the things you've learned?" I went, I and I think of myself as a newbie. But then I have 6 novels currently out, a couple dozen short stories. I've got 3 either nonfiction or nonfiction-esque, and more on the way. I'm not the newbie that I have in my head.
Yeah.
So I need to get over myself a little bit. I have benefited from being shepherded. Lydia Scherer is a fantastic author. She writes Love, Lies, and Hocus Pocus. I've gotten to sit at her feet. I've gotten to learn from her directly as she sells her books at conventions. She brought me in to sell with her so I could learn her method. And I've benefited from that incredibly. And I'd like to be able to pass that on. I always feel a little weird because I don't know who or how to do that without sounding like a real arrogant jerk.
Yeah. But there's they call it the theory of mind, this thing where when you've learned something, you think other people automatically know it and you forget that you learned it.
Yep.
So a classic example of this is they bring a kid into a lab and they have him open up this thing of M&Ms. And when he opens it up, there's actually raisins inside. Then they close it up and they bring in a brand new kid who wasn't there. And they ask the kid, what does this other kid think is inside there? He'll go, raisins. Just completely not remembering the fact that it was a surprise to me when I learned that. I just assume everybody knows it. And so I think you've gotten to a point at which you've learned all of this stuff, but you don't realize that you've learned it. And so you might be thinking, oh, this is knowledge everybody has, when it's really stuff that you've kind of carefully gleaned over a significant amount of time. You may know more than you think you know, and not realize the degree of other people's ignorance.
To a certain extent, yeah. And you're right.
Yeah. So this was super helpful for me.
I'm open for questions, and I know my wife would be as well. So feel free to shoot us more as you have them, or we can have more of these conversations.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I think this is helpful. Hopefully it will be of interest too. I'm going to throw it up on the Yield YouTube, and maybe there's somebody who's interested in some kind of publishing, right? We've covered quite a bit of different kinds of styles and so on. So hopefully it'll be interesting to somebody else as well.